Hello, everybody. As we get towards the end of the year, we're doing a number of shows on reassessing the year in terms of American domestic and foreign policy. And when it comes to foreign policy, Charles Kupchan has a particularly smart way of seeing things. He wrote a very interesting piece in January of this year, January 2025, on the end of what he calls Pax America. He's not the only person to talk about Pax America and its ending, but it's a very smart essay on what Trump needs to get right about Pax Americana. It wasn't an intuitively anti-Trump piece, although it wasn't a MAGA piece either. Almost 12 months later, I thought it'd be a good opportunity to talk to Charles about 2025 and this end of Pax Americana and whether Donald Trump has negotiated it well. So, Charles, what has the last 12 months told us about this end of the Pax Americana age?
Good to join you again, Andrew. It's been quite a year. I don't know about you, but I'm exhausted. Maybe living in Washington.
Well, that's because you've got three small children, Charles. So
got three young
whether
kids.
or not Pax Americana was going or not, you're always going to be tired.
Yeah, that's true. But the world and the United States in that world are both a little bit upside down right now, and I think it's safe to say that we've hit a historical inflection point of sorts, and that America First breaks with the traditions of American foreign policy that have essentially been in place from World War II until the Trump era. And the disorienting feel abroad is matched by the disorienting feel at home, where we have a president who was testing the limits of executive authority, where things are happening on deportations, on the rule of law, on intimidation of media and free speech in ways that I think many of us would have never imagined. So, if I were to sum up how I see things, I think Trump is a needed corrective. We were in a situation in which the so-called liberal internationalism that emerged during World War II wasn't working at home. It wasn't working abroad. Many Americans feel left behind by globalization and abandoned by the political establishment, Democrats and Republicans alike. And Trump steps in to that space and says, I hear you. I am going to go after the political establishment. I am going to right the wrongs that have ravaged middle-class America, and I'm going to fix a world that has become too dependent upon American power and purpose. But I think that Trump has so far been more a demolition man than an architect. He has brought down the world that America made, but he hasn't made much progress in putting something new in its place. And I have my doubts about whether that's going to happen, because this is a president who knows what he doesn't want, who has powerful instincts and impulses, but at least as far as I can tell, hasn't generated the strategic vision that's needed to build an America or a new international order that is fit for the 21st century.
In your Atlantic piece from January, you quote the anti-fascist Italian Antonio Gramsci, who very famously wrote in his notebook when he was in Mussolini's prison in 1930, when he wrote, "The crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear." It's a very Machiavellian understanding of history. In defense of Donald Trump, not that I'm a great admirer of him, Charles, it's very hard, borrowing from Gramsci's language, which you're quoting, when the old is dying, everyone becomes a demolition man, don't they? You have to be. You don't really have any choice because you never quite know what the new is, but you know what the old is, and it needs to be destroyed.
I would agree with that, Andrew. And I think that Gramsci, in many ways, encapsulates our moment, our predicament. We are in a Gramscian interregnum between the old and the new, and lots of morbid symptoms are appearing. The arc of history was bending toward more freedom and democracy for the last couple of 100 years. Now it's bending backwards toward autocracy. We live in a world that is globalized and interdependent, where collective action is needed to tackle everything from climate change to the deployment of AI to nuclear proliferation. But globalization is fragmented and fracturing. And so we really do see a system that is in many respects coming apart at the seams. And, Trump gets a lot of this, right? Trump understands that the United States was overextended. As he said in the recent national security strategy, we're not going to be the atlas of the world anymore.
His famous comments about civilizational erasure, at least his warning to Europe.
Yes, there I'm less supportive of the document than on some other fronts. I think that Trump demonstrates a needed transactionalism and pragmatism. The war in Ukraine needs to come to an end at the negotiating table, and Trump is doing the right thing by talking to the Russians. Biden was all about democracy versus autocracy. Well, we now live in a world in which democracies and autocracies need to work together to tackle global challenges. I think Trump is doing the right thing by moving us in that direction. So there are things that he's doing that needed to be done. But as I said, I really do fear that we're going to get to the end of the Trump administration 3 years from now, and we'll all be standing in the rubble, left behind by the destruction of the old system. And it will really be on the shoulders of the post-Trump president and the post-Trump generation to build what comes next.
Like being in Berlin in 1945. You wrote a couple of years ago, Charles, a very interesting book, Isolationism, A History of America's Efforts to Shield Itself from the World. And you came on the show back then, and you defended what you called Kissinger's pragmatic realism. Coming back to Gramsci and this revolutionary new world, there are international relations experts who would argue that there never really are revolutionary systems. There's power, and that power manifests itself in different ways. And every challenge to statesmen, whether it's Trump or Metternich or Wilhelm II or Napoleon, they're always the same. Is there some fairness to that? And coming back to your friend Henry Kissinger, I'm not sure if he's really your friend, is what Trump needs a good dose of pragmatic realism?
I think that's what the United States needs, a good dose of pragmatic realism, because I do think that after the end of the Cold War, when the United States was no longer checked by the Soviet Union, by another pole of power, the United States began to overdo it ideologically and strategically. And the forever wars in the Middle East, the market orthodoxy and free trade that was unleashed in the 1990s, the dismantling of unions and the welfare state, all of this has come home to roost. And I do think that there was an ideological triumphalism. This is what Frank Fukuyama called the end of history that has gotten us into trouble. And I do think that what we need is a more realistic and a more pragmatic foreign policy. And I do think that Trump is taking us in that direction. That having been said, I do think one of the most notable and unique aspects of the United States as a great power is that from the very beginning, from the founding era, we have been an idealist power navigating a realist world. We have never tolerated the idea that this is just another normal country playing by the rules of realpolitik. We wanted to change the world and make it a better place. And yeah, the United States has made lots and lots of mistakes. The United States has at times forsaken its own idealist values. But I think in some ways what Trump is doing is accepting that instead of the United States changing the world is changing America. And now we're just another normal realist power, making deals, making bargains, no real concern about the ethics of the country and the ethics of the executive branch. And that to me is a disappointment. And so even though
disappointment in the sense that it's possible to be an exceptional country, or a disappointment because Trump doesn't get it. He's not playing by the rules of Washington, D.C. and the State Department.
No, I think it is possible to be an exceptionalist country as long as we pursue those goals in a measured, balanced, and pragmatic way, which we were not. But what I fear Trump is doing is abandoning those goals. He's giving up on the idea that the United States is a country that can make the world a better place, make it more just, make it more free. He's giving up and just accepting that the world has changed America and made it just another realist country like Russia or China. And that, I think, is a mistake. And I think it's something that will, in the end of the day, defeat Trumpism and will lead to the erosion of his political support. Because Americans have always, I think, rallied around the idea that the United States has a special mission in the world, and abandoning that mission will not go well in the long run.
I mean, people on the left in particular, Gramsci was around today, might even say, well, Trump's simply telling the truth. America's always been a colonial imperial power from Vietnam through Grenada and Iraq and Afghanistan and blah, blah, blah. He's simply acknowledging what liberals or policy experts at the State Department are not willing to acknowledge. Charles, it's not an alternative, is it, between either being some sort of JFK style or FDR style idealistic bastion, or Xi's China and Putin's Russia? There are other alternatives, aren't there?
Well, I am someone who thinks that we as a nation need to continue to strive to find that sweet spot between idealism and realism. And I think it would be a pity if the country abandoned the effort to push the arc of history toward more justice and toward more freedom. Has the United States made mistakes? You bet. Is American history shot through with episodes of racism? You bet.
I didn't talk about racism. I'm simply talking about, we're not talking about domestic policy. We're talking about catastrophic wars overseas. I mean, 3 immediately come to mind in the last 50 years: Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. So we're not talking about arcs of history or MLK. We're talking about America as a superpower, which has behaved like any other superpower in history, claiming to do right, but actually pursuing its own interests.
I think that's too black and white. I think the United States did, in many respects, change the world. It defeated Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. It stood by fellow democracies at a time when the chips were down. Does that mean that there aren't very serious blemishes on the American record? Some of them you just mentioned: Vietnam, Abu Ghraib, Iraq, Afghanistan, overreach. But I think on balance, when you compare what the United States has done as a great power with what more normal great powers have done, the track record looks pretty good.
More normal being what? Britain, France?
More normal being the behavior of countries on the international stage prior to the arrival of the United States that took a firm position against imperialism and colonialism, that pushed France and Britain and other European powers to dismantle their colonial empires, that favored self-determination and the spread of democracy. Has it worked perfectly? Absolutely not. But on balance, has the United States that we've seen emerge on the global stage since 1945 tried to exercise its ideals and not just its power? Yes.
What I can't understand, or what I can't figure out, Charles, is whether the system's going back to some sort of 19th century great power equilibrium, going back, and people talk about the Donroe Doctrine, obviously with reference to Monroe. Trump's been very active. He's continuing to be active as we speak in Venezuela. His envoy is talking about America's right to Greenland, all sorts of bellicose language on the Panama Canal and many other strategic interests in Latin America. Are we returning to the 19th century? You talk about America being different from every other power, but late 19th century, mid-19th century American diplomats and politicians viewed Latin America as their backyard. Teddy Roosevelt, who's up on Mount Rushmore, was himself an enthusiastic fighter of overseas wars, claiming American land here and there. So are we returning to something which are we going back in history to borrow from Gramsci's dialectic? Or are we emerging into something new that we haven't seen before in this second quarter of the 21st century?
Well, just to pick up where we left off in the previous discussion, I think in some ways 1898 and the bout of imperialism that we saw with the Spanish-American War underscores the degree to which the United States isn't just a normal power, because it struggled with a republic becoming an empire. There was an anti-imperialist backlash against internationalism that was the result of the fact that the United States took all of these territories from Spain, the Caribbean, and the Pacific, but didn't know what to do with them. And Americans were very uncomfortable turning into an imperial power. And we saw that backlash. But coming to your current question, Andrew, I think that in many respects, what you see in Donald Trump is a president who wishes that it were the 19th century. Because when I look at America First and the outlines of Trump's approach to the world, I see a grand strategy that is isolationist, unilateralist, anti-immigrant, and protectionist. And that is to a T American grand strategy from the founding era, really until 1945, with the exception of this aberration beginning in 1898. But we didn't like becoming a global power. We didn't like empire. We didn't like World War I. And so in the 1920s and 1930s, we went back to a much more isolationist strategy. But the 19th century did afford the United States a natural security, strategic immunity, big oceans to the north, to the east and west, nice neighbors to the north and south. Those days are gone, right? We now live in an interdependent and globalized world with the internet, with pandemics, with fighter aircraft, with ballistic missiles, with satellites. And in some ways, I see Trump struggling to go back to a more isolated, detached America, but he can't. And that's because the world won't let go. The United States is too firmly entrenched in the world. And I think that's why you see him struggling, talking about going back to the Monroe Doctrine, but deploying forces in Asia, in Europe, in the Middle East, just like previous presidents. One other comment that I make here is, I think that in Trump, one sees the signs of the fact that he's a real estate developer. Why is he talking about Canada and Greenland and the Panama Canal? Because he's opening a map and he sees this big land on top of the United States. He says, I want that. And then he sees a big island next to Canada. He says, I want that too. And then there's a connection from the Atlantic and the Pacific. He's thinking about the world in very geographic terms. And again, that's kind of taking us back to the world of the 19th century.
Yeah, very concrete terms as a real estate developer. Very different from the abundance debate on the left and all the promises of the end of scarcity and AI and all that sort of thing. And it's perhaps reflected in his vision, if it is a vision or dream or absurd fantasy, of building a $112 billion strip in Gaza to turn it into a luxury destination for him and his friends. Is this the new aspect, Charles? I mean, it seems Steve Walt wrote an interesting piece in Foreign Policy a few days ago suggesting that Trump's fake peace deals are dangerous. I mean, whether it's Ukraine or certainly Gaza or other hotspots in the world, Cambodia and Thailand, he seems to make up these peace deals. Is that new in international politics? Bismarck didn't do that, did he? Churchill didn't do that, didn't just make stuff up. Stalin certainly didn't.
You know, I can't think of any precedent where a president, a prime minister, a king, whatever, went out and claimed all of these peacemaking deals that don't really exist. And in many respects, Trump kind of wills these. He brings leaders to the Oval Office and he has people sign various documents and he claims credit for ending wars. And then a few days later, war breaks out again. And so there is really no there, but Trump does see himself as the consummate negotiator and the deal maker, and he wants to be the peacemaker, and apparently he wants to get a Nobel Prize. Listen, these are noble instincts. I give Trump credit for giving it a try.
Nobel Prize instincts or noble in a moral sense?
Noble in the sense that we need fewer wars, right? I mean, the fact that Trump actually got a peace deal between Israel and Hamas, even though it's very uneasy and killing continues, that's a big deal. He deserves credit for that. Is he going to be able to take it to the next step and create a Gaza with a new governing council and get the Israelis to pull back and build on regional peace? Who knows? But of all the various peace deals that he's claimed to have achieved, the one that he deserves credit for is between Israel and Hamas, where so far full-scale war has not yet reignited.
You wrote an interesting piece a couple of weeks ago in the Times on Trump now officially disdaining Europe's elites. Merz, the German chancellor, recently also announced the end of the Pax Americana. Charles, are the Europeans finally getting it? I mean, I'm from Europe originally, but there is something rather annoying about Europe's elites, aren't there? And their arrogance and their inability to actually understand the world or think that we're still in the 19th century.
You know, I find the Trump administration's hostility toward Europe a bit puzzling, because Europe may be frustrating. Europe may not carry its own weight, but it's the best ally that the United States has. And I think the animosity toward Europe comes from different quarters. For J.D. Vance and the MAGA movement, I think it's about culture and social values, that Europeans are the secular liberals that are undermining, quote unquote, Western civilization. For Trump, I think it's more about the infringements on sovereignty entailed in building an integrated Europe and the degree to which the EU is, in Trump's mind, a scheme to undermine the American economy and create unfair trade deals. Clearly, there's also a sense that Europeans are freeloaders. They're a big, wealthy trading bloc. They have high standards of living. Why should we be the ones to defend them against Russia? They should be defending themselves. So I think for all those three reasons, there really is antipathy toward Europe in a way that is puzzling. And I think it's hard for the Europeans to deal with it. And I give them credit for trying to keep Trump on side. It's not pretty, it's not comfortable, but what the Europeans have done when it comes to working with Trump on Ukraine, raising defense spending within the NATO alliance, at times flattering Trump even when he doesn't deserve it, I think this is probably the right strategy because they're playing the long game and they want to make sure that they don't get to the end of the Trump administration and find that the transatlantic alliance is kaput.
Well, speaking of the long game, is there a place for Europe in this new world, this new 21st century world? Clearly, America will remain a great power, maybe a regional power. Certainly, China aspires to be a great power, and it's without question a regional power. Russia has its own, perhaps rather parochial regional power ambitions. But what becomes of Europe? Is it the fourth player in a three-game system? Are they the last person left on the floor? Speaking of those dance games where three succeed and one is left to wither away.
You know, I think in the first instance, there will be two leading powers in the coming decades, and that's China and the United States. They will be far ahead of the rest well into the second half of this century. And I would point out that the United States, for the first time in its history, is going to face a peer competitor. And what I mean by that is that the Soviet Union never really was able to keep pace with the United States, particularly when it came to technology. They topped out at about 55% of US GDP.
And ideology.
In the case of China, I would say you're looking at a full service superpower with a high-tech establishment that rivals Silicon Valley and what the United States can produce. And that is going to be hard for the United States to get used to. But then there will be a large number of other players, including Russia, India, Turkey, the European Union, collectively and individually, that will be middle powers, if you will. And so I think the landscape that we're looking at is going to be much more multipolar than bipolar. Lots of fluidity, lots of changing alignments. In some ways, I think the country that best demonstrates where we're headed is India. India pursues what it calls a strategy of multi-alignment. What does that mean? One day they're the best friend of the United States and Modi is here for a state dinner with Biden. Then he flies off and hugs Putin in Moscow. Then he goes to Beijing and rubs shoulders with Xi Jinping. This is the world that we're headed toward, much more fluid, much more unpredictable, not the fixed alliances that we've been used to.
And shouldn't we welcome that? I mean, shouldn't that be something that we look forward to? A lot of people, I've got a friend who runs a podcast called Global Disorder. He's always troubled by anything that isn't certain. But isn't this a relatively healthy world, especially compared to America's unhealthy unipolar moment that you write about in your Pax Americana piece, or the bipolarity of the Cold War? Or the sort of the colonial balance of power in the 19th and early 20th century?
Well, you know, it's a world in which there will be new opportunities, especially for those countries that are climbing the ranks. And I do think that you see in what we now call the global South a desire for more influence, for more authority, for more responsibility, for more agency than we've seen in a very, very long time. And from the perspective of equality and equity, this is a better world. That having been said, multipolar worlds are more difficult to manage. The United States won't be able to get its way as often as it has in the past. As we move from unipolarity toward multipolarity, you're going to see more great power competition. The world will be more difficult to govern. And I do think that this is the moment, Andrew, when we need to start thinking about what that multipolar world looks like. What new institutions of governance are we going to need to
it's your Gramscian world that you talk about, Charles. The Republicans are at least debating it. There are cleavages now between the MAGA wing and the old internationalist wing within the Republican Party. I had an interesting interview of Gavin Newsom, the supposed frontrunner for the Democratic presidency in 28, with Ezra Klein. They said nothing about foreign policy. Why are the Democrats like deer in the headlights when it comes to this structural change in the world? Why are they not really? I mean, even Bernie Sanders, for all his radicalism, doesn't really address America's role in the world.
Well, I think we're at a point in which the country has turned inward, in part because of widespread economic insecurity, in part because of the mistakes that successive administrations made in the Middle East. And as a consequence, there's a lot more discussion and focus on the state of the domestic economy and how to repair a country that has become so deeply divided. I don't think either Republicans or Democrats have really joined this debate yet, in part because it's not politically palatable to start.
I strongly disagree. For better or worse, the Republicans have. They're very strong opinions about Israel, America's role in the world within the Republican Party, and they're not always in agreement. But I don't hear anything from the Dems except that they want to go back to some sort of idyllic Clintonian world somehow.
Well, I don't think that either party has really begun a serious conversation about what comes after Pax Americana. Some people think that Trump is pushing the world towards spheres of influence, maybe, but if so, it's very poorly articulated and a bit of a strategic mess. I think in the case of the Democrats, you're looking at a party that is ideologically incoherent. The progressive wing and the centrist wing really agree on very little. We just saw, on the one hand, a Democratic socialist, Mamdani, get elected to mayor in New York City. In Virginia and New Jersey, centrist candidates winning the races for governor there. And that's just, I think, a sense of the diversity within the party. But I do think that you're going to see the Democrats focus like a laser on the cost of living, on affordability, on economic insecurity.
Yeah, I mean, that may be true, and I'm not suggesting they shouldn't, but my question in this conversation is about foreign policy. It seems as if most of the Republican Party, and implicitly at least the Democratic Party, they're all isolationists now, of one kind or another.
That's probably putting it too strongly. I wouldn't. Trump himself has neo-isolationist instincts, but toppling the regime in Venezuela and bombing Iran is not quite isolationism.
I mean, those are his video. I mean, I don't know if Trump plays video games, but it seems what he's doing in Venezuela is akin to an 85-year-old man, whoever old he is, playing video games.
Well, we've still got almost 80,000 troops in Europe and tens of thousands across various locations in the Far East. So the United States has not yet packed its bags and gone home, and I don't think it's going to. But I don't think that either Democrats or Republicans have really started a conversation about America's next role in the world. And I think it's a conversation that we need to have.
Put it mildly.
That we aren't yet having.
So let's end, Charles, on 2026. You've talked and I'm quoting you, correct me if these are the wrong words, you talk about a sweet spot between idealism and realism. That sounds to me Brookings speak, or the speak of professional experts like yourself. It's not entirely clear what it means. I mean, we're all into that sweet spot between idealism and realism, but it's not very realizable, is it?
I do think it is realizable. I think it means an America that retrenches from areas of lesser interest, but stays engaged in managing great power politics. I think it means an America that remains a team player, but through coalitions of the willing, what I would call multilateralism light. I think it means an America that steps away from the hyper-globalization of the 1990s that in many respects expedited the hollowing out of our middle class and our political center, in favor of not protectionism, because I think Trump is really in many respects doing more harm than good to working Americans, but a more modest brand of globalization in which the benefits of trade are more equitably shared within the United States and across countries. So I think there is a middle ground here between what I would call the overreach of globalization and globalism and the siren call of nationalist retreat. And I think one of the issues that the United States needs to join is how do we find that middle ground, and how do we rebuild support across the American public in urban areas, in rural hamlets alike, for a more modest but sustainable and steady brand of American internationalism.
Well, speaking of rebuilding, let's end on a very, very concrete note in terms of foreign policy, because that's your area. In terms of 2026, what should Trump do, for example, in Gaza? What would you like him to do?
What I would like him to do is stand up as quickly as possible this technocratic council that is going to oversee Gaza. In other words, put more governing authority in the hands of Palestinians that are not Hamas, get a Hamas police force, a non-Hamas police force in the streets so that we see the Hamas either disarm or put their weapons back under lock and key, and begin to put together some kind of international stabilization force and start the process of rebuilding Gaza, delivering humanitarian assistance, get the region back up and running. And then finally, I do think that we're looking at a radically altered Middle East. Hezbollah, Hamas, the Syrian regime, Iran have all been dramatically weakened. And if Trump is going to make good on his pledge to be a peacemaker and a deal maker, this is the time to try to work with Israel and its neighbors to build a Middle East that heads in the direction of regional stability. And that is going to take some kind of self-determination for Palestinians, a deal between Israel and the Palestinians, and that's going to require pressure from Trump on an Israeli electorate that is not yet ready to make those sorts of compromises.
So that's your sweet spot on between idealism and realism in the Middle East. What about Ukraine, Charles? You've written extensively on it. I know you're a keen observer of the Russian war in Ukraine. What should Trump do? He's got a lot of criticism for seemingly at least being a rather, and not so much a secret, rather open admirer of Putin's methods and his bellicosity in Ukraine.
I mean, I give Trump credit, as I said, for reaching out to Putin. This is a war that will end only if the United States and Russia are talking to each other. And I think the allure for Putin of coming in from the cold, of having a rehabilitated relationship with the United States, is one of the key incentives driving Putin toward potentially ending the war. What's missing in my mind is that Trump needs to put more coercive pressure on Putin, both through economic sanctions, but more importantly, by making it clear that he is willing to provide the economic and military assistance to Ukraine needed to ensure that Putin can't win. Because I think that Putin will stop when he is stopped. I think if he runs into a wall of steel in Ukraine and realizes that he's not going to get any further than he's already gotten, he may well make a deal. Right now, we're in a very tentative moment. The Ukrainians are being pressed to voluntarily withdraw from the rest of Donbass. If Putin gets the 20% of Donetsk that he doesn't yet have, is he going to stop? Will he let the rest of Ukraine go? That, to me, remains to be seen. But in my book, the key test of whether a deal is acceptable or not is whether the 80 or so percent of Ukraine that is on the other side of that ceasefire line is free, independent, secure, and able to make its own decisions about the future. If that's the case, if the Russians are in fact prepared to let Ukraine go, then I think Zelensky should take the deal.
Well, maybe someone should write a book about Putin entitled The Man Who Came In From the Cold. Finally, these adventures in Latin America, Charles, Venezuela, and no doubt other small countries that Donald Trump might wake up one morning in a bad mood and invade. Should you just stop doing these sorts of things? I mean, the Venezuela regime is pretty nasty. If Trump was a progressive, I think some people on the left would actually be applauding it. We had Shadi Hamid on the show recently. He has a new book out suggesting that America should still actively try to make the world a better place, which presumably includes bringing down nasty regimes in places like Venezuela.
Well, I think Trump is playing with fire by going after the Maduro regime. I don't have any love for the Maduro regime, but I think we may have learned our lesson in the Middle East, in Libya, in Syria, in Iraq, Afghanistan, that we topple regimes at our own peril. You just don't know what happens. And even though I sympathized with Trump's effort to get a handle on illegal immigration and on drug trafficking, I don't sympathize with what I would call illegal, questionable, if not illegal, strikes against boats in the Caribbean and the Pacific. And I do think that even though he may want to put pressure on the Maduro regime, going in and using force to topple that regime is inconsistent with Trump's own claim to get out of the business of nation building. And in many respects is, I think, spinning the dice and engaging in yet another bout of regime change that may not end well.
Well, Charles Kupchan, thank you so much. You're addressing unpleasant realities of the end of Pax Americana, what comes next. As you suggest, it's still not clear. 2026 might bring a little bit more clarity. We'll definitely get you back on the show then. Happy New Year, Charles, and we'll talk in the not too distant future. Thank you so much.
Good to be with you, Andrew. Look forward to the next.